The first thing everyone noticed about him was his size. He stood in line with the other recruits, shoulders narrow, arms thin, his uniform hanging loose in places where it fit the others just right. When the morning lights came on inside the training hall, the difference was impossible to ignore. Some recruits smirked, others whispered. A few didn't even try to hide their laughter. Boot camp was not a place known for kindness. It was a place built to break people down, to expose weakness before rebuilding strength. And to most of the men standing there, the thin recruit at the front of the line already looked broken. He kept his eyes forward, jaw tight, hands clenched at his sides. He had learned early that reacting only made things worse. The instructor stepped into the room moments later. He was a man shaped by years of command, broad shoulders, sharp eyes, a voice that could cut through noise without ever needing to rise. When he walked, the room seemed to straighten itself. Conversations stopped, smiles vanished. "Eyes front," the instructor said. The laughter died instantly. The recruits stood still as the instructor paced slowly in front of them, stopping now and then to study a face, a posture, a breath taken too fast. He wasn't looking for strength. He was looking for cracks. When he reached the thin recruit, he paused. Just for a second longer than necessary. The instructor said nothing. But the silence did more than words ever could. A few men behind the thin recruit exchanged glances, already convinced they knew how this would end. The instructor moved on. The day continued with drills, commands, repetition. Sweat soaked through shirts. Muscles burned. The thin recruit struggled to keep pace, not because he lacked effort, but because his body simply gave less to work with. The mocking returned in small ways. A shoulder bump in the hallway. A quiet laugh during formation. A nickname whispered just loud enough to hear. He ignored it all. That night, while the others talked and joked in their bunks, he sat on his bed in silence, staring at the floor. Not angry, not ashamed, just focused. He had been underestimated before, many times. What no one there knew, what no one could see, was that he hadn't come to training to prove anything to them. He was there because of something written down long before he ever put on a uniform. Something recorded, something documented. Something that, at the right moment, would speak louder than his body ever could. The next morning, the instructor stood at his desk with a stack of files. Names, numbers, records. He flipped through them without much interest, until one folder made him stop. His eyes narrowed. He turned the page, then another. The room was quiet, too quiet, and for the first time since training began, the instructor looked up. Not at the strongest recruit, not at the loudest, but at the thinnest one in the room. Everything changed in that moment, but no one else knew it yet. The instructor kept his face still, but his eyes had changed. Most recruits never noticed details like that. They were too busy thinking about themselves, about pain, hunger, sleep, and the fear of failing. But the thin recruit saw it immediately. He had spent his whole life watching people, reading rooms, measuring danger by the smallest shift in tone. The instructor looked back down at the folder as if to make sure he hadn't misunderstood what he was reading. He hadn't. He turned one more page, slower this time. Across the room, the recruits stood in formation, shoulders stiff, feet planted, all pretending they didn't care what was happening. But they did. Every one of them. Boot camp had a strange kind of entertainment, and it usually came at someone else's expense. The thin recruit felt the air tighten around him. He didn't know what was in that folder. Not exactly. He knew what should be there, in the simplest sense. His medical intake, his test scores, his background forms. But the way the instructor held it now, the way his jaw set, told the thin recruit something didn't match expectations. The instructor shut the folder. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. "Recruit," he said, voice flat. "Yes, sir," the thin recruit answered immediately. "Step forward." A few men behind him exchanged quick looks, barely containing their excitement. This was it, they thought. The moment where the weak one gets singled out. The moment where the room learns a lesson. The thin recruit stepped forward anyway. His name was Evan Mercer, 21 years old, 5'10", but built like a wire. Not sickly, not frail, just thin, the kind of thin that looked wrong in a place filled with broad shoulders and loud confidence. The instructor studied him for a long moment. The room could hear its own breathing. "What is your weight, Mercer?" the instructor asked. Evan swallowed. 147, sir." A few quiet laughs slipped out before they could be stopped. The instructor's eyes snapped toward the sound. The laughter died like a candle blown out. He looked back at Evan. "You know what people think when they see you?" the instructor asked. Evan kept his eyes forward. "Yes, sir." "And what do they think?" "That I don't belong here, sir." The instructor nodded slowly, as if confirming something. Then he did something unexpected. He opened the folder again and held it just slightly away from his body, as if it carried weight that wasn't made of paper. "Mercer," he said, "what is this?" Evan's throat tightened. He didn't move. "Answer," the instructor said. Evan took a careful breath. "My record, sir." The instructor stared at him. "This is not a normal record." The room went still. Evan felt heat rise in his ears, but his face remained calm. He had learned to keep it that way. Calm was armor. "I don't know what you mean, sir," Evan said. The instructor flipped the folder around for a moment. Not enough for the others to read, but enough for Evan to see the top page. A bold line of text. A stamp. A signature. Evan's stomach dropped. Not because he was surprised by what it said, but because he knew exactly why it was there. He looked back up quickly. The instructor lowered the folder again. "Do you want to explain this to me?" the instructor asked. Evan paused. There were moments in life where you could feel two futures splitting apart. One where you stayed quiet and kept control, and one where you spoke and lost it. Evan had lived most of his life choosing quiet. But he could tell the instructor wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was asking because the folder forced him to. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Evan asked. The instructor's eyes narrowed. "Granted." Evan's voice came out steady. "My father served," he said. A few recruits shifted. That wasn't unusual. Plenty of fathers had served. But the instructor didn't blink. Evan continued. "He was killed overseas when I was 10. Now the room truly listened. Evan didn't look at the others. He spoke to the front wall, as if words were easier that way. "They gave my mother a flag," he said, "and a letter, and a promise that they would take care of us." The instructor's face didn't move, but his grip tightened slightly on the folder. Evan swallowed once. "But promises don't pay bills, sir." Silence. Evan felt his heartbeat in his throat, but he kept going. "My mother worked 2 jobs, he said. She didn't complain, not once. But I heard her cry at night sometimes when she thought I was asleep." One recruit in the back shifted again, less comfortable now. Evan's jaw tightened. "I started running when I was 12, he said. Not for sports, for work, for money, for everything I could carry." The instructor's eyes remained fixed on Evan as if he were measuring him in a different way now. Evan took another breath. "When I was 16, my mother got sick," he said. "We didn't have enough. I tried to enlist early. They said no." The room stayed frozen. "So I trained," Evan said simply. "Every day. Quiet. Alone. I didn't have money for gyms. I had a backpack filled with books and a hill behind my house." The instructor's lips parted slightly as if something about that image landed harder than expected. Evan kept speaking. "My record," he said, "has things in it that don't show up on my body." The instructor held up the folder a little. "You mean this," he said. Evan didn't need to see it again. He could picture the words, the stamp, the note, the reason the instructor looked pale. Evan's voice lowered. "Yes, sir." The instructor stared at him for a long moment, then looked past Evan, over the line of recruits. "Any of you laughing?" he asked quietly. No one answered. The instructor turned back to Evan. "You're not here because you want to be seen," he said, almost to himself. Evan blinked. "No, sir." The instructor glanced down at the folder one last time. His eyes moved across the page like he was reading it again in his head. Then he shut it and stepped closer to Evan. His voice dropped so only Evan could hear. "You have no idea what kind of attention you just brought into my training cycle," the instructor said. Evan's stomach tightened. "Sir?" The instructor's eyes held something Evan hadn't seen before in this place. Respect, concern, maybe even caution. "After formation," the instructor said, still low, "you report to my office." Evan didn't move. "Yes, sir." The instructor stepped back, face hard again, returning to the role the room expected. "Back in line," he barked. Evan returned to formation. Behind him he felt it. No laughter now, no smirks. Just something colder. Uncertainty. Because the men who had mocked him suddenly realized the instructor had seen something they hadn't. And whatever it was, it had changed the rules. Evan reported to the instructor's office exactly 3 minutes after formation ended. Not because he was eager, because he had learned long ago that when authority called, arriving early was the only way to keep control of the situation. The hallway outside the office was quiet. Too quiet. The walls were bare, painted in the same dull color that stripped places of personality. Evan stood at attention, eyes forward, breathing steady. "Enter," came the voice from inside. Evan stepped in and closed the door behind him. The instructor sat at his desk with the folder open in front of him. The overhead light cast sharp shadows across the room, cutting everything into clean lines. This was not a place where emotions were meant to live. The instructor didn't look up right away. "How long have you known this would follow you?" he asked. Evan understood immediately what he meant. "All my life, sir." The instructor nodded slowly, flipping a page. "Most recruits try to hide things," he said. "You didn't." Evan hesitated. "I didn't know I could, sir." The instructor let out a breath through his nose. Not a laugh, not approval, just acknowledgement. "This record," he said, tapping the folder once, "doesn't belong in boot camp." Evan's chest tightened. "I don't mean that as an insult," the instructor added. "I mean it literally." Evan waited. "You've passed evaluations most men never even see," the instructor continued. "Physical tests, endurance trials, cognitive stress assessments, all before you were 18. Evan's hands curled slightly at his sides. "I didn't have a choice," he said quietly. "No," the instructor replied. "You didn't." The instructor finally looked up. "For someone who looks like you do," he said, "this record is unusual." Evan met his gaze. "Sir, may I ask a question?" The instructor studied him for a moment. "Go ahead." "Why is this a problem now?" Evan asked. The instructor leaned back in his chair. "Because boot camp is about building soldiers from nothing," he said. "And you didn't start at nothing." Evan frowned slightly. "You started under pressure," the instructor continued. "The kind most men don't experience until years later, if ever." He closed the folder halfway. "And pressure changes people." Evan said nothing. The instructor watched him closely. "Tell me something, Mercer. Why didn't you say anything when they mocked you?" Evan answered without hesitation. "Because they weren't wrong about what they saw." The instructor raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "They saw a thin body," Evan said. "That's real. I can't change that by arguing." The instructor nodded slowly. "But they didn't see everything," Evan added. "And what didn't they see?" Evan took a breath. "How long I can keep going?" The instructor held his gaze for a long moment. "That," he said finally, "is exactly what concerns me." Evan blinked. "Sir, you're used to operating quietly," the instructor said. "Used to being underestimated. That's dangerous." Evan stiffened. Dangerous to who? The instructor didn't answer right away. "Boot camp will push you," he said instead. Not because you're weak, because someone like you doesn't break the same way others do. Evan felt a chill settle in his stomach. You don't complain, the instructor continued. You don't ask for help, you don't draw attention. Men like that don't raise flags until it's too late. Evan's voice stayed calm. Sir, I know my limits. The instructor's eyes sharpened. Do you? Silence stretched between them. The instructor stood and walked toward the window, staring out at the training grounds. Your father's service record is attached to this, he said quietly. Evan's breath caught despite himself. He was decorated, the instructor continued, but more importantly, he was reliable, calm under fire, the kind of man others leaned on. Evan swallowed. That's what they told us. The instructor turned back to him. Pressure doesn't just run in families, he said. It teaches. Evan felt something shift in his chest, not pride, not fear, recognition. You're going to stay in my platoon, the instructor said, but things will change. Evan straightened. Sir? I'll be watching you, the instructor said. Not because I doubt you, because I don't. Evan didn't know how to respond to that. The instructor picked up the folder again. If you push past your limits without telling anyone, he said, you'll wash out. Not because you failed, but because you hid it. Evan nodded. Understood, sir. The instructor paused. Do you want to know what made me stop when I read this? He asked. Yes, sir. The instructor held up a page. It wasn't the scores, he said. It wasn't the endurance tests. Evan waited. It was the note from the evaluator, the instructor said. The one that says, this candidate continues long after physical shutdown would be expected. Evan closed his eyes for a brief second. The instructor lowered the page. That's not strength, he said. That's survival instinct. Evan opened his eyes. I know, he said quietly. The instructor studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. Return to your barracks, he said. Training resumes at 0500. Evan turned to leave, then hesitated. Sir? The instructor looked up. Thank you for reading it, Evan said. The instructor's expression softened just enough to notice. That's my job, he replied. Evan stepped out into the hallway. The noise returned slowly. Boots, voices, movement. But something was different now. Recruits looked at him without speaking. Some avoided his eyes. Others studied him like a puzzle they hadn't solved yet. No one laughed. That night, Evan lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't come to boot camp to stand out. But now the record had spoken. And once something like that is seen, it can't be unseen. Tomorrow the training would be harder. Not because he was weak, but because someone finally knew he wasn't. Training changed the next morning, not in obvious ways. There were no speeches, no announcements, no public correction of the men who had mocked Evan before. Boot camp didn't work like that. It preferred quiet pressure, invisible weight, but Evan felt it immediately. The drills were longer, the pauses shorter. Commands came faster, stacked one on top of another without warning. Where the others saw routine, Evan recognized design. Someone was watching how he responded when there was no room to prepare. By mid-morning, sweat soaked through his shirt. His arms trembled not from fear, but from the steady burn that never quite went away. He didn't slow down. He never did. What changed was the way the instructor watched him, not hovering, not singling him out, just measuring. During a long run, one of the recruits beside Evan stumbled. His foot caught the edge of the path, and he went down hard, breath knocked clean out of him. The line hesitated for half a second, just enough to notice. Evan slowed without thinking. He reached down, grabbed the recruit's arm, and pulled him back up in one smooth motion. No words, no drama, just movement. The instructor's voice cut through the air. Keep moving. Evan didn't argue. He adjusted his pace so the recruit could keep up without falling behind. It cost him effort. It always did. Later, during drills, Another recruit failed a sequence, hands shaking, eyes unfocused. Evan stepped in silently, repositioning him, guiding his movements just enough to keep the line intact. Still no words. Still no recognition. But the instructor saw it all. By the end of the day, the men were exhausted in the deep way that sleep didn't fix. In the barracks, conversation stayed low. No one joked. No one laughed. Evan sat on his bunk, unlacing his boots slowly, methodically. He had learned to do everything that way, slow enough to stay in control, fast enough not to be noticed. A voice broke the quiet. "Hey." Evan looked up. It was the same recruit who had laughed on the first day. Broader than Evan, louder too. At least he used to be. "What?" Evan asked. The recruit hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Why didn't you say anything back then?" Evan didn't answer right away. "About the jokes," the recruit added. "About, you know." Evan tied the knot on one boot before speaking. "Would it have helped?" he asked. The recruit frowned. "I don't know." "Neither did I," Evan said. The recruit nodded slowly. "The instructor watches you." Evan met his eyes. "He watches everyone." "Not like that," the recruit said. Then he added, quieter, "You scare him." Evan shook his head. "No, he's worried." The recruit blinked. "About what?" Evan didn't answer. That night, the training hall echoed with a sharp whistle. "Formation," the instructor barked. The recruits lined up quickly, tension buzzing through the air. The instructor paced in front of them, hands clasped behind his back. "You're being evaluated," he said flatly. "All of you." No one moved. "Most of you think this place is about strength," he continued. "It's not. It's about judgment." He stopped in front of Evan. "For example," the instructor said, "who here thinks the smallest man in the room is the weakest?" No one answered. The instructor's eyes swept the line. "Good, because if you still believe that, you haven't learned anything." He stepped back. "Mercer," he said, "step forward." Evan did. "Turn around." Evan turned, now facing the line of recruits. "Look at him," the instructor said to the others. "What do you see?" Silence. Finally, someone spoke. "He doesn't quit, sir." The instructor nodded. "Anything else?" "He pays attention," another said. "He helps without asking," someone added. The instructor waited, then spoke. "You didn't say strong," he said. "You said reliable." He turned back to Evan. "That's not an accident," he said. "That's learned behavior." The instructor dismissed the formation soon after, leaving the words hanging in the air. From that night on, things shifted. The mocking stopped completely. Not replaced by praise, but by something heavier. Expectation. Recruits began to look to Evan during drills, not because he was in charge, but because he stayed steady when others didn't. When confusion spread, Evan moved first. When someone hesitated, he didn't push, he guided. And when someone fell behind, he didn't leave them. The instructor noticed something else too. Evan never took credit. When drills went well, he stepped back. When mistakes happened, he absorbed blame quietly. He corrected errors privately, never publicly. It wasn't humility. It was instinct. One afternoon, during a high-pressure exercise, the recruits were pushed beyond schedule. The sun beat down. Water breaks were limited. Fatigue crept in like fog. Evan felt it earlier than most. Not because he was weaker, but because his body had learned to operate past warning signs. He recognized the signals immediately. The dull ache behind the eyes, the slight delay in response. He adjusted his breathing, slowed his steps by half a beat. The instructor saw that too. "Mercer," he called. "Yes, sir." "Front and center." Evan stepped forward. "You're compensating," the instructor said quietly. "Yes, sir." "Why?" "To maintain output," Evan replied. The instructor studied him for a moment. That strategy works, until it doesn't. Evan nodded. Understood, sir. The instructor leaned closer. You don't need to prove endurance here. Evan's voice stayed calm. I'm not trying to. The instructor held his gaze, then stepped back. Fall back into formation. That night, Evan lay awake longer than usual. The weight wasn't physical this time. It was the awareness that once people start to rely on you, failure no longer belongs only to you. He had carried responsibility before, at home, growing up too fast. But this was different. This was visible. And visibility came with consequences. The next phase of training loomed ahead. More pressure, less margin. Evan closed his eyes. He didn't know how far this would go. But he knew one thing for certain. The record hadn't just changed how the instructor saw him. It had changed how everyone would depend on him. And once that happens, there's no going back to being invisible. The fourth week of training began without warning. No announcement, no explanation. Just a quiet shift in tone that every recruit felt the moment they stepped onto the grounds. The days grew longer. The margin for error disappeared. Instructions came once, never twice. This was the phase where bootcamp stopped testing effort and started testing judgment. Evan felt it immediately. The exercises were no longer about how fast you could run or how many repetitions you could push through. They were layered now. Physical strain mixed with confusion. Orders overlapped. Timelines compressed. People started making mistakes. Not small ones. The kind that happened when fatigue met pride. During a navigation exercise, one recruit misread a marker and led his group in the wrong direction. The mistake wasn't caught until minutes later, when the instructor's voice cracked through the field. Stop. The group froze. The instructor walked slowly toward them, eyes scanning faces. Who made the call? He asked. No one answered. Silence stretched. Evan stepped forward. I should have double-checked it, sir, he said. The recruit who made the mistake turned sharply toward Evan. It was me. The instructor raised a hand. I didn't ask who touched the map, he said. I asked who allowed the decision to stand. His eyes stayed on Evan. Evan nodded once. That was me, sir. The instructor studied him for a long moment, then turned away. Reset, he said. You start again. No punishment, no shouting. But the message landed. Responsibility was no longer theoretical. Later that night in the barracks, the recruit Evan had covered for sat on the edge of his bunk staring at the floor. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. Evan shrugged. You won't make the same mistake twice. The recruit looked up. How do you know? Because you care now, Evan said. The recruit swallowed. Why do you? Evan didn't answer, because caring had never been optional. As the days passed, the pressure intensified. Sleep came in fragments. Meals felt rushed. The body learned to operate on less than it wanted. Tempers shortened. Voices sharpened. One night during a late drill, a recruit snapped. I can't do this anymore, he muttered under his breath. The instructor heard him. He stopped the entire formation. You, he said, pointing. Step out. The recruit hesitated, then stepped forward. Explain, the instructor said. The recruit's shoulders sagged. I'm done, sir. The instructor didn't raise his voice. Everyone gets tired, he said. Everyone hurts. He paused. But not everyone quits. The recruit stood frozen, eyes down. Evan watched closely. He knew that moment. The instructor turned to Evan. Mercer, he said. Where are you right now? Evan answered immediately. Here, sir. And where is he? The instructor asked. Evan hesitated just a fraction of a second. He's ahead of himself, sir. The instructor nodded slowly. Exactly, he said. He's already living in the next hour, the next day, the next failure. He turned back to the recruit. Go sit down. The recruit blinked. Sir? You heard me. The recruit stepped aside, stunned. The instructor addressed the formation. This is what leadership looks like, he said. Not strength, not noise, presence. His eyes swept the line. If you can't stay where your feet are, you don't belong here. That night, the recruit Evan had spoken for approached him quietly. Why did you answer like that? He asked. Evan sat on his bunk, cleaning his boots slowly. Because panic moves faster than truth, he said, and it always lies. The recruit nodded, absorbing the words. The following week brought the evaluation exercise. It was the kind designed to overwhelm. Teams were assigned, roles were unclear, time was limited, equipment was intentionally incomplete. Confusion spread quickly. 2 recruits argued over direction. Another froze, waiting for orders that never came. Voices overlapped. Evan stepped in. Not loudly, not forcefully. He repositioned people, reassigned tasks, simplified the objective. Do this first, he said, then that. Forget the rest. Someone pushed back. That's not what the instructions said. Evan met his eyes. The instructions don't account for panic. The instructor watched from a distance, arms crossed. The team completed the task just under time. When it was over, the instructor approached Evan. You rewrote the plan, he said. Yes, sir. Why? Because the plan wasn't working, Evan replied. The instructor studied him. And if it failed? Then it would be my responsibility, Evan said. The instructor nodded once. That night, Evan sat alone outside the barracks, staring at the dark sky. His body ached in places he didn't usually notice. His mind felt heavy. The instructor joined him without a word. You know what your problem is? The instructor said after a moment. Evan didn't look up. Yes, sir. What is it? I don't know when to stop, Evan said. The instructor exhaled slowly. Neither did your father, he said. Evan's chest tightened. The instructor looked at him. He was good, reliable, trusted. He paused. He also didn't come home. Evan swallowed hard. That's why I'm watching you, the instructor continued. Not because you can't handle pressure. He turned slightly toward Evan. But because pressure will never tell you when it's enough. Evan nodded once. I won't let that happen, he said quietly. The instructor didn't answer immediately. Good, he said finally, because the next phase will try. He stood and walked away. Evan remained seated, staring at the ground. For the first time since training began, doubt crept in, not about his ability, but about the cost of it. He had learned to survive by carrying more than his share, but survival and leadership were not the same thing, and bootcamp was no longer asking whether he could endure. It was asking whether he could endure without disappearing into it. The final tests were coming, and they would demand more than silence. The final phase of training began before anyone was ready for it. It always did. The recruits were woken in the middle of the night, lights snapping on, voices cutting through sleep without warning. There was no explanation, only orders. Boots hit the floor. Gear was grabbed in the dark. Confusion followed them out into the cold air. Evan moved automatically, not fast, not slow, just precise. He had learned long ago that panic wasted energy. He counted breaths as he dressed, grounding himself in simple motions. Around him, others rushed, fumbled, cursed under their breath. Outside, the instructor waited. You have 15 minutes, he said. Then you move. No one asked where. The exercise stretched on for hours. They carried heavy loads across uneven ground, navigated obstacles with limited visibility, followed commands that changed halfway through execution. Fatigue layered on top of confusion on top of fear. This was the test that broke people. Evan felt his body pushing back early. His legs burned. His shoulders ached under the weight of the pack. The familiar signals appeared, the quiet ones that warned him he was crossing a line most people never reached. He adjusted his pace. Shorter steps, slower breathing. But he didn't stop. At one point, a recruit stumbled hard and stayed down. The line hesitated. "Move!" someone shouted. The instructor said nothing. Evan dropped to a knee beside the recruit. The man's face was pale, eyes unfocused. "Look at me," Evan said calmly. "You're not done." The recruit shook his head. "I can't." "You can," Evan said. "Just not alone." He shifted the weight, redistributed the load between them, and pulled the recruit back up. The movement cost Evan more than he wanted to admit. They moved on. The instructor watched without comment. Later, during a timed objective, confusion spread again. The instructions were intentionally vague. Time bled away while the team argued. Evan stepped in. "We don't need all of it," he said. "We need enough." Someone challenged him. "That's not the order." Evan met his eyes. "The order doesn't matter if we fail." Silence. They followed him. They completed the task with seconds to spare. By dawn, the recruits were beyond exhaustion. Faces were drawn, movements slow. Some stared at the ground as they walked, already halfway gone. Evan felt the edge closing in. This was dangerous territory for him. He had lived here before. The place where the body stopped asking and the mind took over completely. The place where you could keep moving long after you should have stopped. The instructor noticed. "Mercer," he called. Evan stopped. "You're drifting," the instructor said quietly. Evan blinked. "Sir?" "You're not present," the instructor continued. "You're functioning." Evan swallowed. He knew the difference. "Step out," the instructor said. Evan hesitated. "Now." Evan stepped aside. The line moved on without him. For the first time since training began, Evan stood still while others continued. It felt wrong, unnatural, almost painful. The instructor stood beside him. "You think stopping is failure," the instructor said. Evan didn't answer. "You learned that early," the instructor continued. "Stop means things fall apart. People suffer." Evan's jaw tightened. "But here," the instructor said, "stopping is control." Evan looked at him. "Sir, if I stop, you won't disappear," the instructor said firmly. "And they won't fall apart." He gestured toward the team. They were slower now, but still moving, still functioning. "You're not their engine," the instructor said. "You're their anchor." Evan felt something crack, not in his body, but in his understanding. "You've been carrying weight that isn't yours," the instructor said. "That's not leadership. That's habit." Evan looked away. "My father did the same thing," he said quietly. The instructor nodded. "I know." They stood there in silence as the sun rose higher. "Get some water," the instructor said. "Then rejoin them." Evan did. The final evaluation came later that day. No shouting, no rush, just a single task given under strict time constraints. The team moved with quiet efficiency now, less frantic, more deliberate. Evan didn't take charge this time. He delegated. He watched. He corrected only when needed. And when the task was complete, he stepped back. The instructor addressed them at the end of the day. "You've all been tested," he said. "Some of you passed by strength, some by persistence." His eyes moved to Evan. "And some of you learned when to stop." The instructor dismissed them. That night, the barracks were quiet in a different way. Not tension, relief. One recruit approached Evan as he sat on his bunk. "You okay?" the man asked. Evan nodded. "Yeah. You scared us earlier," the recruit admitted. "When you stepped out." Evan looked up. "Why?" "Because we rely on you." Evan paused. "That's why I stepped out," he said. The recruit frowned, then slowly nodded. Later, as Evan lay staring at the ceiling, he felt something unfamiliar. Not pride, balance. He had spent his life believing value came from endurance alone, from carrying more, longer, without complaint. But today had taught him something new. Endurance without judgment was just survival. Leadership required something harder: trust. The final day of training loomed ahead: graduation, evaluation, assignment. Evan didn't know what waited beyond that, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of stopping. He had learned that being seen didn't mean being exposed, and that strength, real strength, wasn't proven by how much you could carry, but by knowing when to set it down. The final day arrived without ceremony. No alarms in the dark, no shouted orders ripping through sleep. The recruits woke to a quiet morning, the kind that felt earned. Boots were laced with care. Uniforms were straightened and checked twice. No one joked. No one rushed. Outside, the air was cool and clear. They stood in formation one last time. The instructor walked the line slowly, stopping in front of each recruit, not to inspect posture, but to look. Really look. Faces told stories now. Not everyone would carry the same ending, but everyone had been changed. When he reached Evan, the instructor paused. Not longer than before, but long enough. "Mercer," he said. "Yes, sir." "You ready?" Evan thought of the night drills, the wait, the moments where stopping felt like failure. He thought of the first day, the laughter, the smirks, the certainty that he didn't belong. "Yes, sir," he said. The instructor nodded once and moved on. They were dismissed shortly after and directed to the hall for final evaluation and assignments. The room was clean, bright, and strangely formal compared to the chaos they'd lived in for weeks. Chairs scraped softly as they took their seats. The instructor stood at the front with a stack of folders. Records. The same kind that had changed everything weeks earlier. "Today," the instructor began, "you receive your evaluations. Some of you will continue on. Some of you won't." No one reacted. "This is not a reward," he continued. "It's a responsibility." He opened the first folder and began calling names. One by one, recruits stood, received their assignments, and returned to their seats. Some faces tightened, some relaxed. A few nodded quietly, already accepting what came next. Evan waited. He felt steady now, not numb, not braced for impact. Just present. "Mercer," the instructor said. Evan stood. The instructor looked down at the folder in his hands, then back up. "Step forward." Evan did. The room was silent. "Before I read this," the instructor said, "there's something you all need to understand." He closed the folder. "Records don't make soldiers," he said. "They explain them." He turned slightly, addressing the room. "Some records tell you what a person can lift. Some tell you how fast they move." He looked back at Evan. "And some tell you what they do when there's no margin left." The instructor opened the folder again. "Evan Mercer," he said, voice calm, "assigned to advanced training." A quiet ripple moved through the room. The instructor continued. "Not because of physical strength," he added, "but because of judgment under pressure." He closed the folder and met Evan's eyes. "You didn't prove yourself by pushing through," he said. "You proved yourself by knowing when not to." Evan nodded. "Thank you, sir." The instructor hesitated, then extended his hand. It wasn't protocol. Evan took it anyway. The handshake was brief, firm, respectful. When Evan returned to his seat, no one laughed. A few nodded. One man leaned over and whispered, "About time." Later, after the room cleared, the instructor called Evan back. This time, it wasn't formal. The door closed softly behind them. "You know," the instructor said, "most people think records are about the past." Evan listened. "They're not," the instructor continued. "They're warnings." Evan nodded. "I know." The instructor studied him for a moment. "You broke a cycle here," he said. "Not by being louder, by being aware." Evan hesitated. "Sir, my father." "I know," the instructor said gently, "and you're not him." Evan felt something loosen in his chest. You don't need to carry his ending, the instructor added. You get to write your own. Evan took a slow breath. Outside, the recruits gathered their bags. Goodbyes were quiet, plans exchanged in low voices. Some would see each other again, some wouldn't. When Evan stepped out, the man who had laughed on the first day stopped him. Hey, he said. Evan waited. I was wrong, the man said. About you. Evan nodded. So was I. About some things. They shook hands. As Evan walked away from the training grounds, duffel slung over his shoulder, he felt lighter than he had in years. Not because the path ahead would be easy, but because it would be honest. Weeks later, when he stood alone with his assignment papers folded neatly in his pocket, he thought back to the moment that had changed everything. The folder opening, the instructor going pale, the sudden shift in the room. People would always see what they wanted first: size, shape, silence. But somewhere, written down in ink and verified by truth, was the part that mattered. The part that said, this one endures, this one notices, this one stops when it counts. Evan looked ahead. The world would test him again, harder this time. But now he knew something he hadn't before. Strength wasn't about proving others wrong. It was about being ready when they finally looked. And when they did, he would be standing exactly where he needed to be.